Hello and welcome. I'm Jordanna Gessler, Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for the first program in our new monthly series that will virtually take you into our archive for a behind-the-scenes look at some of our most fascinating artifacts in our collection. Our archive is normally locked and inaccessible to the public, so we are excited to take this opportunity to share some of our most spectacular and unknown collections. Joining me today is my colleague Christie, the museum's collections manager, who is joining us from inside our archive. Together we'll be showing you artifacts from the museum's Bernd Stevens Collection, which I believe is one of Christie's favorite collections. So right now we're looking at a picture of Bernd with a camera, as well as what our archive shelves look like. Christie has actually removed some of the boxes and pulled out some of the primary sources that we will be sharing with you today. So a little bit about our archival collection. I'm going to give that to Christie to walk us through because she definitely has spent many more hours inside our archive than I have.
Thank you, Jordanna. So a little bit about our archive. We have approximately 610 collections and sub-collections, or somewhere around that number, with about a little over 20,000 artifacts and documents. So many of the collections relate to a particular person or have been donated by a family, and can include materials such as photographs or documents, three-dimensional objects such as badges, pins, textiles, family heirlooms, and then we also have quite a sizable collection of survivor testimony as well. So this collection is somewhat unique in that it isn't just paper materials such as birth certificates and letters and other official documents from Bernd Stevens' life, but it also includes other things from his experiences during wartime, such as some of the Nazi paraphernalia that he brought back with him, some of his pins and medals from his service in the military, some Judaica, and then it also has paper items such as letters, poetry, and other items that are actually written in Bern's own hand.
So what makes this collection unique compared to some of our other collections that are donated by a singular person?
So I would definitely say that often when we get a number of items that are donated by one single person, it might be largely paper-based, so it could be letters and documents and photographs. Particularly when it's related to a family, it can often be a variety of those things specifically related to the family's history. And in saying that too, our archive is definitely, I would say, more paper-based than anything else. We do definitely have other artifacts and objects within the collection, but the majority of what we have is definitely paper-based. And Bern's collection is unique because it has more of a variety of different items. And you can see the image on the left on the screen gives you a flavor of some of the different things that are within the collection. So it's not just photographs and documents, but other items that are actually contained in that collection as well.
So there are many more 3D artifacts. So when we think of objects in the sense of what do we find in a historical museum, we have artifacts and objects, we envision 3D pieces, but what you're telling me is most of the time artifacts and objects are actually 1D, or I guess is it 2D, and 2D or 1D. But what makes this unique is there's actually three-dimensional things that we can look and examine and pull apart and open and close, all while wearing proper gloves.
Correct.
And I know there'll be time for questions and Q&A for everyone. So if you have a question, please throw it into the Q&A box. We will get to it at the end of the program. So first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about pre-war life in Germany. Bernd was born in Munich in 1920 to Paula and Eugene, and he was the eldest of 4 children. He had 2 younger brothers and 1 younger sister. His father was a businessman, had a storefront in Munich. The family was fairly, a traditional German Jewish family in the sense that they weren't extremely Orthodox or religious and lived a fairly secular, in the term of German Jewish life. And they were in Munich, which is one of the largest cities in Germany. It's also very famously or infamously known as the birthplace of Nazism with Hitler's failed putsch in the 1920s. But I just wanted to give a little background on and contextualize what German Jewish life looked like specifically in Munich. As we know, or as many of our viewers already know, less than 1% of the German population was Jewish before Hitler came to power in 1933. The majority of them did live in Berlin, although Munich did have a considerable number of Jews living there. And a little bit about the history piece of it is that the Munich Jewish community dates back to the 13th century. So it's quite an old community. It remains an old community. There's still a synagogue and a community there. But at the time, there was a sizable number, about 12,000, 11,000 German Jews living in Munich in 1933 when Hitler came to power. In 1944, there were less than 10 Jews living in Munich. And following the end of the war in 1945, about 300 returned. So virtually most of the community was lost. And we will, talk a little bit about Bernd's family specifically. But just, imagining what his life would have been like, he would have gone to school with Jewish and non-Jewish kids. His family attended one of the many synagogues in Munich. And, you can see these photographs. The family looks relatively what we would assume as an everyday family with everyday joys. And I'm going to now turn it over to Christie a little bit to show us some of the artifacts that are in the collection.
Yeah, so you can see from the photos that Jordanna just showed, but this is also a closer image of that. So this is a picture of the Steiner's children. So in the back there, you can see Bernd, and he had 3 other siblings, Elsa, who is the girl, Kurt, who was the middle brother, and Herbert, who is the baby in this picture. And so, as Jordan mentioned, the family was, reasonably comfortable, middle-class Jewish family living in Munich, as Bernd describes it. This is a picture of the family. The father, Eugene, actually owned an optometry business that had a shop front in Munich that was also photography equipment and had a darkroom as well. So, yeah.
I love that family photograph of Bernd with his siblings, especially because it was actually all the rage at that time for kids. It was very, very trendy for them to be dressed in these little sailor suits. And there's so many photographs in our collection of children from this time wearing these outfits. And actually a copy of this photograph right now resides in our World That Was gallery, in our first gallery of the museum. It's so, so important for us to show the vibrant Jewish community and life that existed before the Holocaust, and really to understand what existed, what was there in Europe, and to give us more meaning and sense of what was lost. And so definitely that's one of my favorite photographs of Bernd. It's just so, so precious. And now we're going to hear a little bit of an excerpt from Bernd's USC Shoah Foundation testimony.
So I probably just want to talk a little bit about maybe the lead up.
And then I said goodbye to my father.
In the testimony, if that's okay, Jordanna.
Of course.
So basically, the family didn't, while they did obviously experience some anti-Semitism, they didn't experience necessarily what they considered was an issue. And actually in the lead up to Kristallnacht, Bernd's father Eugene, who was a World War I veteran, really felt that the fact that he had served his country in World War I was going to hold them in good stead and really protect them from the anti-Semitism that was happening around them. And basically all of that changed with Kristallnacht when the family store was vandalized, and actually Eugene, Bernd's father, was arrested and sent to Dachau. So they actually realized at that time that they were definitely facing danger, and decided that they needed to escape Germany, basically. And so essentially they tried to get visas and tried to appeal to authorities that they because they had relatives in France, and so tried to get visas to France, which actually didn't eventuate. And so then Eugene, Bernd's father, had the, I think, ingenious idea, and to be honest, I haven't heard it mentioned of the other survivor stories that I have heard from working at the museum. He managed to get hold of a US directory and looked through the directory to find other families that had the same last name as them, and was able to find 2 names in major cities in the US, and so wrote letters to those families, even though he'd never met them and had no connection to them whatsoever, and said, "Dear cousin, we would love our son Bernd to come to the US. Please, is there any way that you could sponsor him and help him to come?" And then they waited, and miraculously they received a response from one of those families that they had appealed to saying, "Dear cousin, we would love to have Bernd. Please let us know when he's coming." So the family quickly tried to go and get US visas. And so basically they went to the consulate to try and do that. And unfortunately, the family was able to get visas with the exception of Kurt, who was, like I said before, the middle brother in this picture, as he had asthma. So he was actually rejected for a visa. And Bernd's father, Eugene, this is a little bit of a closer image of him, was actually born in Poland. So he was also not able to get a US visa because of the quota system, which, Jordanna, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and even before we start talking about Kristallnacht, so of course, when Hitler came to power in 1933, within several months, there were many anti-Jewish laws that came out, and eventually in 1935, all German Jews were stripped of their citizenship under the Nuremberg laws. But the real, I think, clear violence or threatening of life for German Jews was Kristallnacht. But didn't Bern experience anti-Semitism earlier than that, around the 1936 Olympics?
Yes, actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I guess it's a fun fact about him, and something that I have only recently discovered during COVID, when I have been working from home and had more of a chance to delve deep into this collection. I recently discovered that he was actually a very accomplished skier that had been skiing since he was a child, and qualified as an alternate for the 1936 Winter Olympics on the skiing team, but was actually rejected and not able to compete because of the fact that he was Jewish.
Yeah, so in the 1936 Olympics was this incredible opportunity for Hitler and the Nazi government to prove themselves to the world that they were a legitimate country, they were a legitimate government, and that they were ruling their country with respect and dignity at some level to their citizens. And a few different things happened during the 1936 Olympics that make it such a noteworthy moment in world history. One of which was that the Nazis, aware of the fact that there would be so much international press, actually removed many anti-Jewish signs that had already been put up in public in the previous 3 years. So signs barring Jews from entering parks or stores, or signs saying don't buy from Jewish businesses, Jews cannot sit on park benches, etc. So many of those were removed, and unfortunately, it actually hinted at the German Jewish community that perhaps things were going to get better. I think very many German Jews hoped that they could remain in Germany under Hitler. As you mentioned, Christie, Bern's father, had served in World War I. There was a very large number by percentage of German Jews who fought and received medals during World War I, fought for Germany. And they saw themselves as German. They saw themselves as part of a country that they would be willing to risk their lives for. And they were very hopeful that things would get better. So the 1936 Olympics was this interesting turning point. However, in the last moment, Nazi Germany forbade any German Jews from participating on their Olympic team. And although most world countries did not use their position to boycott the Olympics, there were several athletes on the American team that boycotted the Olympics and used their position in the public eye to kind of speak out about injustices that were happening all around them. Another very noteworthy moment in the 1936 Olympics I'll just speak to for a second is that Jesse Owens won several gold medals and broke world records. And this very much went against Nazi sort of pseudoscience that believed that the Aryans were the most pure and powerful race in the world, which was why they had forbidden German Jews from participating on their team, because they believed Jews to be inferior. So I'm sure for Bern, this was probably a signal personally that he experienced that most other German Jews didn't, in the fact that he was unable to participate on the German team. And then, of course, with Kristallnacht in November of 1938, Bern's family was living in Munich, and Munich actually was the base in which Kristallnacht began. The phone call that was made to other Nazi officials throughout the country to, unleash violence against Jewish businesses, whether it was beating Jews in the street or setting fire to synagogues or destroying Jewish owned businesses like Bern's family's business or homes, the call was made from Munich. And this was really, I think, the heart of some staunch anti-Jewish sentiment, especially because it was considered the birthplace of Nazism. And in fact, in the lead up to Kristallnacht, there was a lot of violence against German Jews living in Munich, and their businesses and several synagogues had already been destroyed. So I think for Bernd and his family, it was really, really clear that there was an increasing danger for them, and probably his father being arrested and sent to the concentration camp Dachau probably pushed them to really think creatively, as you said, in ways to get visas. And here I can actually share, before we listen to his testimony, we had some pictures of his passport and his identification card. And here, this is, you can see on his identification card, there is a big J. All German Jews had to have a J marked on their passports. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Christie before I get into the whole visa issue and the difficulties facing German Jews who wanted to leave Germany because of the violence, who were refugees. I'm going to turn it over to Christie to show us this incredible document that we have and just highlight some really unique features of it.
Yeah, so this is the document that we're actually looking at we were looking at on Jordanna's screen. So this is Bern's passport. And you can see, as she mentioned as well in the passport, that the passports have the red J, which identified Bernd as Jewish. And it also, it's a little bit hard to see because of the handwriting, but it also has his middle name here as Israel, which also identified him as Jewish. And then if we turn over to the page that was actually showing on the screen, you can see this has his photograph as a young man and also contains the official Nazi stamps in various places on the page as well.
Yes. All German Jews had to change their name. All men had to adopt the middle name of Israel, and all women had to adopt the middle name of Sarah. So that was another way to quickly identify people on their identity cards under the religion of Judaism.
Yeah, so that also shows on his identity card with the J and also the Israel as well.
And just a little bit about the complications with getting into the US and even why Bern's father and brother had to remain behind. During the Great Depression, there was a huge push to limit immigration to the US. And even by the middle of the 1930s, many Americans continued to oppose immigration on economic grounds. And there was definitely xenophobia and fears that immigrants would steal jobs. Immigrants therefore had to find an American sponsor who would be financially responsible to guarantee that this family would not become a burden on the government or on society or on the state. So, I think Bern's father thinking really creatively of just looking in a phone book and finding somebody with a similar last name and writing letters, and then for that family in the US to even respond and take on this financial burden and sponsor the family was definitely one of the most difficult parts of the American visa process. On top of that, there was a finite number of visas and a quota system. So for the number of people who were allowed in from Germany was different from the number of people who were allowed in from Poland. So because Bern's father had been born in Poland and the Nazi government had really just removed all sort of civil liberties or citizenship rights or civil rights for anyone who had not even been born in Germany, there was no way for his father to enter the US on the same visa that Bernd and the rest of his family was. Just to give you an example, in June of 1938, there were about 140,000 people on the waiting list for the German quota alone. And a year later, in June of 1939, the waiting list length had jumped to over 300,000. So there was a huge refugee crisis. Additionally, the US was very strict about allowing anyone into the country who might have had some sort of pre-existing condition. And so for Bernd's brother to have had asthma made it so the US did not want to admit him and did not offer him a visa. So Bernard's brother Anne's father had to remain behind in Germany. And I'm just gonna now, should we go to the testimony quickly?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just quickly talk about what happened after that. So basically they were waiting for their US visas to come through, and by the time they did receive them, the war had started. And so they were basically helpless and they weren't able to use them essentially. But the family decided that they would try to get out anyway, and so they formulated a plan that Bernd would go first. And he would try to escape Germany via Italy and then board a ship in Italy to get to the US, basically. And then if he was able to do that, he would send word back to the family to let his mother, sister, and youngest brother know that he was able to safely get through. And his mother, had a sister who had married a Danish man and moved to Denmark. And so the rest of the family, in terms of the mother, sister, and his youngest brother, were all going to escape via that way. So basically the conversation, this part of Bernd's testimony talks about the last time that he basically spoke to his family and having to say goodbye to his father.
And then I said goodbye to my father. And I talked to him. I said, you on this crazy quarter, you won't make it if you just sit here. Why don't you, if I have a chance to get out, and if I can make it, I will let you know, and then you get out, some way, anyway. And he said, I'm too old for this, and I'm not going to leave. I've had a good long life. In those days he was in his late 50s. He said, I had a good life. I'm not leaving your brother alone to be taken to a concentration camp at his age. He was 12 years old. And to be transported alone to what he called then a work camp. They had called it work camp. And he was hoping that all it would mean is work. He said, to whatever happens, I will be looking after him. The rest of the family will get out. I feel that it's important for you young ones to leave. It's less important for us who've lived our life. He said, I will get your mother to Denmark some way or another, and I will wait and hope for the best. Maybe this will be over and I'll survive it. But he said, I have my doubts. And I asked him again, and he said, absolutely not. Whatever fate will bring. He said, I want to remind you that don't do anything that you feel that I would be opposed to. And that's the last thing I can tell you. Then he did something he had never done before. He hugged me, and he kissed me. He'd never done that. And then I left. I never saw him again.
It's so heartbreaking thinking about the last moments or hearing about the last moments that Jews had with their family members, with their beloved parents or siblings or children, not knowing that that was the last second or the last moment they would ever have with them. And with the knowledge that there was violence and danger ahead, but I think it's so important that we included part of Bernd's own testimony, his own words, because it's such an important part of our mission at Holocaust Museum LA is to incorporate not only artifacts and primary sources that are so precious from the time of the Holocaust, but also to hear the words of survivors who can share their personal experiences and emotions and reflections in a way that I don't think it cannot be captured in any other way. So I'm glad, Christie, that you wanted to include that piece of his testimony. And I mean, we're going to learn so many incredible stories of Bern's resiliency and strength and courageousness. So even seeing him tear up a little about his, the last moment he saw his father reminds us that he's a human being. We're all human beings, and we have a duty to one another to really uphold the utmost respect for one another. So I'm glad that you suggested using that.
Yeah, and it's you talk about his resiliency and just the fact that he went by himself as a teenager to a foreign country where he didn't speak the language and didn't know anyone is incredible to me. I mean, I am obviously not from the US, so I understand what it is to immigrate to another country, but to do it completely alone and not knowing anyone and not being able to speak the language and really not knowing what you're heading into is just incredible to me.
Yeah, so here he is. I love this photograph with him in front of a palm tree, because definitely palm trees are the symbol of Hollywood and Los Angeles and the West Coast and sunshine and everything that I don't think Germany has. But so tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so he obviously was able to make it to the US. So he went, as I said, via a train to Italy and then boarded a boat to New York and arrived in the US. And then sent word to his family that he had arrived safely. So he originally started out in New York, which is where the family that had agreed to take him on were staying, but he quickly realized that they were obviously a family that had helped many refugees, and there was other people that had moved into the apartment while he was there also, and they really had limited means. So he realized quickly that he needed to move on. And so he moved around to different places. And so this photo that you're looking at on the left right here is a picture of him in Hollywood, like Jordanna mentioned, the iconic palm tree behind him. And then he eventually moved on to Tennessee, where he had a friend that had already immigrated there before him. So he moved there, tried to establish himself, got a job, and tried to quickly learn English. And tried to really get settled. And then a couple of years later, obviously maybe a year later actually, the US enters World War II, and immediately Bernd wants to enlist himself in the US Army, which initially he had difficulty with because he wasn't a citizen. And so he was initially rejected. But ultimately, and a story for another time, that's a whole other story of how he was able to get into the army, but he inevitably made it into the army and basic training. And the picture in the middle there is an image of him obviously in his military uniform, not too long after he had enlisted. And so what happened after that was essentially he was picked up by the Office of Strategic Services, which Jordanna will talk a little bit more about, but basically was the predecessor to the CIA. And in his own words, essentially, he suspected that was due to the fact that he spoke multiple languages, one of those obviously being German, and had a familiarity with Ukraine and the territory where the OSS was looking to operate, essentially.
Yes, so the US joins the war, World War II, in December of 1941, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, who had been allied with Nazi Germany at that time. And so Bern joined the OSS, which, as Christie said, later became the CIA. So definitely was a very intelligent man, had a knowledge for many, many languages. And I know that we have some of his artifacts there with you, Christie, if you can show them to us, the originals.
Yeah, so we have, like I mentioned, the military pictures that we had already looked at. Then we also have some images or photographs of him in training. So these photographs right here you can see Bernd there holding the gun and pointing it in kind of a joking way. So this is actually a picture of him training with the OSS on Catalina Island, the Channel Islands in California. And so we have a few more of these with the group. So this is obviously after it was picked up by the OSS and started training with them. And then there's one more here, and you can see that it's like a little bit lighthearted, maybe not I don't know that much about particular military training, but maybe not what you would expect of military training. I don't know, Jordanna, you mentioned that you've seen photos that might be a little similar to this before.
Yeah, these photographs definitely reminded me of my own grandfather's scrapbook of military training photographs, where it's just a bunch of, I mean, they're teenage guys and they're joking around and they're laughing and they're smiling and they're obviously, you know, forming relationships with one another. I did love these photographs, and I have them, I can blow them up here so we can look at them bigger. Yeah, so those are those photographs that Christie was talking about, which were taken on Catalina Island, which is off the coast of California, not too far away from where we are now at his training camp for the OSS. And he actually was brought in as one of this group later known as the Jewish Five, which was a group of 5 members of the OSS, so part of the US Army, and they were all Jewish, and they were from Germany, the Netherlands, and Hungary. In a very, very, very loosely based, Hollywood tried to capture the OSS operation that Bern was a part of in the highly, highly fictionalized film called *Inglourious Basterds* by Quentin Tarantino. Of course, this film is historically inaccurate in many, many ways, but there was an operation in which the OSS used former German, Dutch, Hungarian nationals who were of Jewish descent and had been forced to flee for their lives just because they were Jewish. And their mission was to infiltrate the area around Innsbruck, Austria, and southern Germany, and monitor the reports of Nazi stockpiling arms and ammunition there. And I'm sure for all of you who had seen that film and the mistake that I think Brad Pitt's character makes when he does this for 3 instead of this for 3, I'm sure because Bernd Stevens grew up in Germany, he would not have made that mistake. And Christie, I'm sure you can tell us a little bit more of his operation. I'm going to go to the next slide. Oh, here, tell us a little bit about these artifacts. I think they are so, so cool. I noticed that I thought his name was Bernd. Why is he all of a sudden called Peter?
Yeah, so you can see, and I can hold it up to the camera too, the larger document that we're looking at is his fake identification document. So, and then the one on the left, you can see, sorry, the one on the right, you can see that's his real military identification. And then we have the fake one as well. So Bernd was part of an operation called Operation Dylan. And this was basically where a group of OSS agents were sent into Austria and parachuted behind enemy lines. And basically with the mission of what Jordanna mentioned, gathering intel and finding out what the Germans were doing and reporting back on their movements. And so the Dylan mission, Bernd wasn't actually a part of the original group that were sent in, and that original group were immediately captured after their parachuting. It basically went wrong in the beginning, and they were captured by the Gestapo and arrested. And so along with them, their radio equipment was captured. And so they sent messages back to the OSS headquarters saying, under duress by the Gestapo, saying, you know, we need reinforcements and more supplies, basically. And unfortunately for Bernd, the radio operator was attempting to send covert distress signals within those messages, but they weren't identified, basically. And so the mission to send in reinforcements and supplies was burned, and he was parachuted in, and unfortunately parachuted straight into a trap and was quickly arrested by the Gestapo. And so this was actually his cover identity that we're looking at right now. It says Peter Hartley, and that was actually a real US soldier. The information, the name at least, on there was actually belonged to a real person. And then the other information belonged to Bernd. And so he was assigned this identity so that he could go undercover as part of that Dylan mission.
So since these members of the OSS group were all Jewish, was this identity part of trying to conceal their Jewish identity in case they were captured?
Yeah, so definitely. He talks about it in his testimony as the fact that this was a real soldier's name that he was given, and also the fact that this particular soldier was Protestant. So he was given this identity card as well as dog tags that indicated that, and the dog tags indicated that he was Protestant. Obviously, the OSS felt that if he was to be captured, the fact that he was Jewish would only create more difficulty for him.
And here, I'll stop the share so we can look at the actual fake identity card. You know, oftentimes in Holocaust history and in Holocaust museums, we talk about Jews in Europe who are living under false identity. But here we also have a US soldier who is additionally a Holocaust survivor living under false identity. And the stress that he must have been under to maintain his fake name, his fake religion, in order to fool his Gestapo captors, I can't even fathom the stress of that.
Yeah, and it's crazy to me too, because he comes across, I mean, I've never met him, obviously, and so I've only looked at, pored over his documents and his collection and listened to his show testimony, but he comes across as quite a lighthearted person, and really cool as a cucumber. Like, I don't know how you could maintain something like that, but he talks on a number of occasions about how he almost was discovered as being Jewish, but he did have blonde hair and blue eyes, so I guess to the Nazis that was kind of an indication that he not to be suspected as Jewish. But he also talks about later on, after he escaped and was recaptured, that it was basically told that he had to take his clothes off, and he was discovered to be circumcised. And then he just yelled at the Gestapo officer and was like, "Don't you understand that everybody in the US is circumcised?" And somehow the Gestapo officer believed him and was like, okay. So he wasn't discovered. So to have the wherewithal to do that and basically to continue under a false identity is just miraculous to me.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to think about that he was constantly coming up with these ideas and plans to protect his own identity and protect himself, because as a Jewish person, if he had been captured by the Nazis and found out to be Jewish, he would have been killed immediately. And not just because he was an American spy, but because he was a German Jew. And in a way, you know, that's a very familiar story, that because the Nazis had so much propaganda talking about how Jews did not have blonde hair and blue eyes, there are many, many survivors who are able to use to advantage the fact that some Jews do have blonde hair and blue eyes. That's totally a normal occurrence. And they were able to use it to their advantage because of the intensity of the Nazi propaganda that many, many Nazi officials and Germans believed it to be true. So it's probably what ultimately helped him a little bit in his concealing of his identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So will you tell us a little bit more about the Ditlinde mission and the Nazi surrender? I know you mentioned that he had escaped and then was recaptured. This is really starting to sound like a James Bond movie.
Yeah. So yes, he was immediately captured when he parachuted in. He escaped and was recaptured. And actually there was one particular Gestapo officer that was one of his captors that he found, or he talks about as being nicer than the rest. And so he had struck up, I guess, a sort of a relationship with this particular Nazi officer, and managed to convince him somehow that, you know, the tide of the war was turning, and that if Germany was to lose the war, he would most likely also be captured and executed. And so he suggested to this officer, how about we make a deal? If you keep me alive, I will keep you alive. Because by this time there was plans in the works to execute Bernd as a US spy. And so he made an agreement with this Gestapo officer that they would both keep each other alive, depending on how things panned out. And the Gestapo officer lost his paperwork. So, you know, the Nazis were very much about documenting everything and paperwork, and there needed to be an extra level of approval basically to execute Bern, because he was considered as a higher up US officer. And so when that paperwork came back with the approval, the Gestapo agent lost the paperwork, and so that further delayed his execution. And then ultimately, as things continued to worsen for Germany, other local Gestapo officers in the area realized that their fate was probably sealed and that Germany was going to lose the war, and so decided that they wanted to surrender in the particular area. So they were in Carinthia in Austria, and decided that they would go to Bern and say, we would like to surrender to you. And so they let him out the second time. He didn't have to escape. And he was given back the radio equipment along with the other members of the team. And they radioed back to the OSS headquarters to say the Nazis here want to surrender to us. Unfortunately, the OSS headquarters thought that it was a joke and thought that it was a trap, basically, and so said, we don't believe you, we need proof. And so then they basically got together and said, well, what can we do? So there was a suggestion that they form a surrender party, and they cross German lines to make it to the nearest US military installment so that they could surrender directly to them. And Bernd basically talks about the fact that is it possible? Are we going to survive this? And the other Germans basically said, it's possible, it's not impossible, it's going to be very difficult. And so they set out to basically get to the US line, and it made it most, like, a good portion of the way there, but unfortunately were stopped by a Nazi colonel, who they explained the situation to. And actually you can see the document that's showing on the screen is actually the confirmation from the US military about the mission and what they were trying to do. We also have a document in the collection that was from the governor of Carinthia, so of the area that they were in, to basically say, these men are part of a surrender party and you should let them pass. And so he showed the documents to the Nazi colonel, but he just said he wasn't having a bar of it. No, we're not surrendering, and basically arrested all of the Nazis in the surrender party for giving in to surrender so easily, and scheduled for Bern to be executed. But by another twist of fate, they happened to come across a higher ranking Nazi official than the colonel that had captured them. And he was of the opinion that, yes, we are going to lose the war, and was actually in surrender negotiations for the area that he was in charge of as well, and said, no, you're not going to execute these men, let them go, and sent them on their way. And so they made it to the US installment of the military, and basically that actually coincided with the more general, wider surrender of Germany at that time. And so they basically then went back to Carinthia, and by that time the British had actually entered the area, and was the liberation was happening.
It's such an incredible story. I know that, and you've mentioned this before, there are so many little pieces of Bern's entire war history, whether it was his time in Italy or his time in Austria, that we don't even have time to go through the incredible pieces of this. But thank you for kind of bringing that all together. And I know that we talked a little bit about how the photograph of him with his siblings is featured in our first gallery at the museum. So as this photograph of him with this car that he has taken, it was a civilian car, but he's taking it for the completion of his mission. It serves as a place in our 7th gallery, which is our Liberation Gallery, where we talk about some of the most well-known figures who liberated concentration camps, like Eisenhower's troops, but also the individuals who were able to liberate, concentration camps in towns and cities. And I always say that, having grandparents who had been Holocaust survivors, I don't know how much longer they could have been alive when liberation took place. And to imagine that these brave men were fighting in order to liberate it and keep and save lives is basically what they did. And I can't even imagine for Bern to be somebody who knew that his father and brother were somewhere in Europe, not knowing what had happened to them underneath during this gruesome Holocaust. And so I can't even fathom what he was personally going through at that time and keeping it all together.
Yeah, and he definitely talks about that in his testimony as being one of the reasons that really spurred him to want to join the army in the first place. Was, he had experienced the persecution at the hands of the Nazis, and his brother and father were still in Germany, and he wasn't sure what their fate was at that point in time. So it was definitely a contributing factor in that.
And I also I know we have a few more slides to go through before we, start taking questions from the audience. But Christie, do you have any other artifacts that you want to highlight? I know there are many there that you feel particularly fondness of. And so before we start talking about his return to the US, I was wondering if you wanted to feature them.
Yeah, so, this is the document that I just mentioned before, which is actually the letter. I don't know if you can see, but it's got the official Nazi stamp on the top, and it's the letter from the governor of the area giving them permission to pass. And then it actually has the signatures of the individuals on the back that were involved in the surrender party. And then so after Bernd was done with Operation Dylan, and after it was completed, he went back to Carinthia with the surrender party and was actually able to provide a lot of really useful intel to the British troops that were there about the movements and activities of local Nazis that helped lead to a lot of their capture as well. And so once that mission was completed, he actually was then sent to the Eagle's Nest, which Jordanna could talk a little bit more about what that is. But it was basically an area that Hitler used as a headquarter or area of sorts that he would stay with a number of other high-ranking Nazis. And by the time that Bern was sent there, it had already been taken by the Allied forces. And so they were really just checking. And he was actually able to take a number of souvenirs with him from the Eagle's Nest. So this is actually a photo of him that was taken for a newspaper article that was done about him. And you can see there's a number of obviously Nazi artifacts and different things on the table. And that's burned in the photo, obviously.
Yeah, so the Eagle's Nest was nestled in Obersalzberg, this beautiful area in southern Germany and Austria, like kind of on the border between the two. It was used exclusively by members of the Nazi Party, specifically, obviously, by Hitler for government and social meetings. It was very close to Hitler's summer home, and it had been undamaged in the April 25 bombing raid. And so then it was subsequently used by the Allies as a military command until 1960, when it was returned to the state of Bavaria. And Christy, can you just show us that picture one more time? Because I know a number of these artifacts are featured in our galleries, including that giant Nazi flag. And there's a specific story behind it, is there not?
Yeah, so it's a little bit hard to tell from the photo. Maybe if I hold it a little closer, you can see that the Nazi flag kind of has a frayed edge on it. And basically it was the flag that was flying over the Gestapo headquarters in the area. And he and three of his buddies basically took this huge flag and separated it into 4 pieces and all took a piece of it back with them. So yeah, and that flag is actually on display in our second gallery where we talk about the rise of Nazism, along with some of the other artifacts. So you can see there's some pieces of Nazi uniforms, hats, and other like armbands and flags. And then we also have in the image, there is actually a dagger. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's a Hitler Youth dagger that we actually have here. And that's one of the items that he actually was able to bring back from the Eagle's Nest.
Yeah, and these are really important artifacts for us to use in the second gallery, where we talk about symbols of hate and how the Nazis manipulated different images and symbols to spark hatred and prejudice and really a major dehumanization process. And so Bern's one of the reasons why we have such a rich collection of them. I also love that he has a Olympic flag as part of his war booty, as sort of this moment where he knows he should have been in the Olympics but was unable to because of the anti-Semitic notions of the Nazi government. And so I know that photograph that I have here was in the newspaper. And I'm just wondering, Christy, can you tell us a little bit about returning from Europe, settling in California, and how did he find out about the whereabouts of his family?
Yeah, so actually it was kind of a twofold thing that he talks about. So he, after the Eagle's Nest mission, he then went back to Munich, so went back to his hometown to see if he could find out any information about his father and brother. And actually his friend Gus, who was the one that was in Tennessee with him, was also working for US intelligence. And so he had actually already heard some information about Bern's family and relayed that back to him. But basically he was able to discover when he went back to his hometown that his father and brother had been sent on a transport out of Munich to Riga. And he found out later, was able to piece together that actually his brother was killed on the transport. He actually suffocated due partly to the fact that he did have asthma, though it wasn't bad when Bernd had actually left Munich. Without the proper medication and being deprived of, any sort of treatment, it did worsen with time, and he actually did suffocate on the cattle car. And his father managed to survive a little longer, but ultimately his father and other prisoners on the cattle car were taken off before they arrived at their destination and were shot, basically. So he discovered that when he returned back to Munich. And so from there, he eventually returned back to the US because the rest of his family was his mother, his sister, and his youngest brother had managed to make it to the US, so they were waiting for him when he went back to the US. And he ultimately, though the OSS was interested in having him continue as an agent and did ask him if he was interested in continuing working with them after the war, he decided that he wanted to be a civilian, and it just wasn't the life for him. He wanted things to return to some version of normal, essentially. And so he ultimately moved to California, actually with his friend Gus. He went back to school and became an accountant. And together with Gus, they set up a accounting firm in California. And the photos that you're looking at here is of his house in California, and then also a picture of him with his daughter. So he ultimately married and had 3 children, so 2 girls and a boy. And then later in life, still in California, eventually he was divorced and then remarried and had 3 more stepchildren from there, and then grandchildren, and so on and so forth.
And he was actually recognized for his heroic actions and received, as a former American spy and Holocaust survivor, he received the Congressional Gold Medal from the US to acknowledge sort of this incredible impact that he had on the war effort. And I think that's also a great part of this, is that he did have an opportunity for people to really honor and thank him for the courageous things that he did. And so, just being considerate of time, I now want to see if anyone has any questions. Any questions from the audience. We're so grateful for you guys joining us today. And so we're here to answer any questions you may have. I happen to know that there are some family members of Bernd in the audience right now. We're so thrilled and excited to have you here. I know David is here, and he is the nephew of Bernd and is part of our audience. And really, we're just very grateful to your family, and we're very grateful that you guys entrust us with preserving these artifacts and preserving the story of your family in perpetuity, to educate the countless thousands of students who enter our museum pre-COVID, but post-COVID virtually enter our museum and learn the important history of the Holocaust and the important lessons of, the dangers of hate rhetoric, the dangers of dehumanization, and the fact that we really truly need to respect one another and build a world of mutual trust and respect and dignity. And so thank you for honoring us with allowing us to tell this story and share the important lessons and messages from here. So let's see if we have any questions. One of the questions is Bernd still living today? Christie, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. He passed away, I believe, last year. So actually, it's great to hear that some of his family are on the Zoom on the talk, because I would love to make contact with you. When I started looking into this collection, some of the things unfortunately are a bit hazy, so it would be great if I would love to make contact to fill in some of the gaps in some of my knowledge. And so when I started looking at the collection, I wasn't in contact information for him, and so I really kind of started searching to try and find out if he was still living. And eventually I made contact with a gentleman who wrote a book about the Jewish Five named Patrick O'Donnell, and he had really interviewed Bernd at length, and so was aware that he had actually passed away. So he let me know that he passed away last year.
And there's a question about when Bernd's family, his mother and his other 2 siblings, his other brother and his sister, can you just share a little bit about how and when they came to the US?
Yeah, so they, as I mentioned before, Paula, Bernd's mother, had family in Denmark, and so they were able to escape to Denmark and then ultimately made their way to the US from there. And I don't think it was too long after Bernd arrived, because there is a photo within the collection, though I don't have it handy, of the family that was in the US. So Bern's mother, his sister, and his youngest brother, and Bern, all standing together. And Bern is in military uniform. So it looks like it was taken shortly after he enlisted. So they were already in the US by that time.
And there is a question about his interview and testimony. So currently the museum's doors are closed, but we've never been more open. When it is considered safe to return back to museums in the LA County and California state, and we open our doors once more, we invite you to come and listen to his full testimony, which we feature at the museum. We have space for anyone who's interested to come and listen from beginning to end from his USC Shoah Foundation testimony. And if you're interested in learning more about this collection, definitely write to us. There are more stories, more information, more historical details. It's unbelievable what this man accomplished. We're happy to share it. And we have a question here, Christie. Do we have any additional family photos from later in his life in front of you?
Oh, no, I think I only have the one of him with his daughter. And actually, I encourage, as Jordanna said, when we reopen, I encourage anybody who's interested to listen to his testimony. It's incredible. And I found out so much more information just from listening to his testimony. The amount of other incredible little bits and pieces of this story, we just didn't have enough time to cover it all. But he does actually, in his testimony at the end of it, they allow time to show photos and other artifacts. So he shows some of the photos that we've looked at today. And he also shows photos, like his family photos from later on once he immigrated to the US as well. So they definitely exist. Unfortunately, we just don't have that many in the collection.
And just wrapping this up, in case anyone has any last questions, you can put them in the chat. But Christie, I have a question for you. So you're sitting in the archive right now. Can you tell us a little bit about the space? What makes an archive an archive? Is it temperature controlled? Is it cold where you are right now? Is it hot? Why are you wearing gloves? What are those boxes behind you? And are they really acid free?
That's a lot of questions. Yeah, so I am sitting in the archive. It is cold. I don't know if you can see, I'm wearing long sleeves. So basically, for the preservation of the artifacts within the collection, we keep it at a constant temperature, or within a range of a constant temperature, and also humidity control. So both of those things are key in terms of preservation. And so the room is climate controlled for that purpose. Definitely you can see that the shelving behind me is metal. I mean, you can probably see the shelves, the movable shelves here within that metal shelving, again, for proper preservation purposes, so that there isn't anything within the shelves that can actually degrade the artifacts if they're placed onto them. The boxes that you may be able to see behind me here are examples of an acid-free box, and basically all that means is just that boxes and the materials that we use to house the artifacts are neutral in order to properly preserve them and not degrade them any more than, just generally they do degrade after time, obviously, because a lot of the things that we are dealing with in the collection are quite old. So it's really just to slow that degradation process.
I see. So everything we do is really with the intent of safely keeping and storing our artifacts in our collection in perpetuity, so that generations of students and visitors can continue learning from Bernard and so many other survivors and liberators.
Correct.
Great. So thank you. So, here we have a question that quickly, does the museum have other extensive archives about Holocaust survivor like Bern's?
Yes, we definitely do. And actually, if you know a little bit about the museum's history, you will know that we are a survivor-founded museum. And so that is essentially the way that our collection started, is through donations of Holocaust survivors, of the things that had survived the Holocaust that they had brought with them. That was where we started. So essentially, there are probably too many to count, different family collections. I have to say that Bern's is one of my favorites, just because the story is so incredible that, like Jordanna said before, it could basically be a movie. But yeah, there are definitely many more like this in the collection.
Great. So before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join Christie and me again for our next Inside the Acid-Free Box program. It will be on Tuesday, October 20th. We will be taking a look at the museum's collection of art by Erich Lespli, who was a Czech Jewish artist who survived Theresienstadt, and actually while in the concentration camp created a pictorial diary, which he then tore up, hid under a barrack, survived, found it, pieced it all back together, and it's such an incredible and unique collection of primary sources that both show us what daily life was like in a concentration camp, speaks to the presence of mind, the thoughts, the fears, the anxieties that Erich and other prisoners were having, and then also the importance of resilience and maintaining spiritual resistance and true human dignity in Erich being an artist before, during, and after the Holocaust. So it will be an incredible program. I invite everyone to join. In the meantime, please join us at one of our upcoming programs on Thursday, September 24th at 11 a.m. Pacific. We'll be hearing from Holocaust survivor Joe Alexander, who truly has such an unbelievable story of survival. He's a Polish survivor. He is 98 years old and during the pandemic learned how to use Zoom so that he can share his story with people like you. So, he's incredible. He continues to surprise and amaze us. I invite you to join us for that on Wednesday, October 7th at 11 a.m. Pacific. Join us for our monthly Building Bridges panel discussion, which includes community leaders. It is moderated by museum board member and USC Professor Dan Schnur, who is an incredible moderator, asks excellent questions, has a wealth of information. He could lead that program all on his own. It's a great program. I invite everyone to come. This month's topic will be what's at stake in the 2020 election. You can find far more information about anything I've said about our virtual events on our website, holocaustmuseumla.org. Thank you again for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.